Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center. Whether you're here in person or beaming in via YouTube, we're happy to have you here. I'm Ray Spicer. I'm the CEO and publisher at the U.S. Naval Institute. We've got a great program lined up for you today. We're here to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Often considered the largest naval battle in history, involving hundreds of ships and over 200,000 naval personnel. This battle was fought in late October of 1944. So you may be wondering why we're celebrating this in early September of 2024, especially on the anniversary of 9/11. I can assure you that wasn't the plan. It was just how the schedules worked out. But having said that, I think it's appropriate that before we dive into the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that we take a moment to reflect on this somber day some 23 years ago when nearly 3,000 lives were taken from us on American soil. And to remember as well the countless sacrifices in the days, months, and years following the attack on our nation. I ask that you take a moment to think of the many people impacted by that fateful day. As you please rise and join me in reciting our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Today's event demonstrates what the U.S. Naval Institute is all about, an independent forum where the exchange of ideas in support of our men and women in the sea services and their histories can be recounted and championed. For many years, notable naval historian James Bradford was among those who contributed to that mission. He was an author, a series editor, and a friend. We mourn his recent passing and celebrate his impact on the study of naval history. He would no doubt have enjoyed the audience and the panelists gathered here today. Before we begin, I would be grossly remiss if I did not give a nod to Jack C. Taylor, the man for whom this wonderful conference center was named. We simply cannot talk about the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center without understanding the great connection that Jack Taylor fought in that battle. If his son Andy were here today, he would no doubt recount some great stories about his father and his World War II experiences. I will attempt to recount just one that Andy shared with us at the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Many of you know, again, one of the largest battles in naval history. The plan on the Allied side was to take torpedo bombers that fly low and slow against the Japanese warships. And essentially that made torpedo bombers sitting ducks because of the gunnery capabilities of the Japanese warships. As Jack recounted to his son Andy, he said the plan was we were going to take fighter aircraft, the F-6F Hellcat, which Jack flew, and because there wasn't much of an air battle or an air capability on the Japanese side at that time during the war, they were going to use these fighter aircraft to go in from high altitude and strafe the decks of the Japanese warships at a steep angle of attack. The reason that they were going to do that was because they knew the Japanese guns couldn't elevate to 90 degrees. They also knew that the Japanese guns were heavily armored in the front and on the sides, but not so much on the top. So again, the plan, F-6F Hellcat, steep angle of attack, come in, strafe what you could, get low, 600 feet, and then try not to impact the water when you were pulling up after the attack. And apparently Jack recounted to Andy, he goes, that was the scariest day of my life. I didn't see water when I pulled up. All I saw was the deck of a Japanese battleship, the Musashi, from left to the right side of my windshield in my Hellcat. So again, scariest day of his life. And then he said, the section leader, after I did that, said, hey, the torpedo bombers aren't here yet, so let's go for another run. So you can just imagine. We call them the greatest generation, and there's a great example of why. With that, I want to jump right in and welcome our panel. Where's our panel? There's our panel.
I thought you were number one. Am I that way? I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're down here. You're over there, Paul.
Oh, okay.
Awesome. Enough chairs for enough people. Great. All right, first of all, we welcome our moderator, Alex Pocklington, otherwise known as Drakenefel. Initially trained as an engineer and developing an award-winning career, Alex later decided to focus on his lifetime passion for naval history, starting the YouTube naval history channel Drakenefel, working with various museums and museum ships to stimulate interest and visits to these institutions, and bringing the works of various historians to a wider audience. He has recently written his first naval history book about HMS Belfast and hopes to write more in the future. To Drac's left, Tom Cutler has been serving in the U.S. Navy in various capacities for more than 50 years, including an in-country combat tour in Vietnam and sea duty in cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and patrol craft. A former faculty member in both the Seamanship and Navigation and History departments at the U.S. Naval Academy, he currently holds the U.S. Naval Institute's Gordon England Chair, Professional Naval Literature, and has been a Fleet Professor of Strategy and Policy with the Naval War College since 1992. He is the author of many articles and books, including A Sailor's History of the U.S. Navy, The Battle of Leyte Gulf, Brownwater Black Berets, Coastal and Riverine Warfare in Vietnam, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf at 75, a retrospective. To Tom's left, Paul Stilwell recently observed his 50th anniversary of coming to work at the Naval Institute. He started when he was 4 years old. Among the various jobs he held were managing editor of Proceedings, editor of the annual Naval Review, director of Oral History, the first editor-in-chief of Naval History magazine, director of the History Division. Since leaving the staff, he's continued to contribute to Naval History magazine, and his oral history interviews have spanned 37 years. The Naval Institute has published 11 of his books, and number 12, about the battleship New Jersey, is scheduled for publication next year. And finally, Trent Hone is an authority on the U.S. Navy of the early 20th century and a leader in the application of complex systems science to organizational design. He studied religion and archaeology at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, and works as a consultant helping organizations learn and innovate more rapidly. Mr. Hone regularly writes and speaks about leadership, organizational learning, and naval history. His most recent book is Mastering the Art of Command, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, and Victory in the Pacific. This conversation will last about an hour, and then we'll open the forum to audience questions. For those live streaming, please type your question in the chat field. Alex will read virtual questions from the monitor on stage. And for those of you here in the auditorium, please use one of the two standing microphones on either side of the auditorium. Please introduce yourself, and please do ask a question. We'll try to address as many as possible. And finally, thank you for silencing your phones. After the panel discussion, our panelists will sign copies of their most recent books in the lobby. Thanks again for joining us today. With that, over to you, Drac.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming, and well, I guess we'll get stuck in straight in with the questions since we are on the clock quite literally. So, gentlemen, obviously, Leyte Gulf, everyone's heard of those three big engagements, Cape Engano, Samar, and Surigao Strait, and they really showcase a lot of the air and sea engagements of the Pacific War and what's happened in the progress of that conflict. But of course, when Admiral Kurita set out with Centreforce, his fleet was significantly more powerful than the fleet that eventually showed up to chase Taffy 3. So what happened to it, and what was the role of US forces in that, particularly in terms of submarines, in both detecting the Japanese forces and reducing them to the strength that they would actually exhibit when they arrive through San Bernardino Strait?
Well, I'll start. You mentioned the submarines. The Darter and the Dace were up there in the Palawan Passage when Kurita was coming to Leyte Gulf, and they happened to be positioned just perfectly that when Kurita came up with his force, they were able to sink 2 of his ships and damage a 3rd. What's particularly interesting about that is that they sank Kurita's flagship with him aboard. So that meant that to start off this thing, he had to take a midnight swim, which I don't recommend for anybody. And he then, besides the fact of just being in the water and going through that trauma, he also lost a lot of his staff. Some were rescued by different ships, so he didn't have his entire staff. A lot of his papers, charts, all these things were gone. So he's kind of having to wing it from that moment on. And I think that shows it has a real impact on what comes later. So I think that's one thing about the submarines. And of course, when he starts to cross the Sibuyan Sea, then Halsey's got his carriers out there and starts attacking them. And they go through horrific, continuous bombing all day. I mean, they don't even have time to eat lunch or anything. I mean, it's just unbelievable, constant contact. So he's going through that, and of course he's also losing some key elements and so forth. We can talk about that. But anyway, so those are some of the things that led up to why he arrives at encountering Taffy 3 with less than he starts with.
I'd like to begin by saluting Rear Admiral Dan Bowler. His dad is the person who hired me 50 years ago, and I had sea duty and I had journalism school, but the clincher was that Dan's dad, Bud Bowler, and I both served in the same ship, the New Jersey, and I think that's the reason I'm here today. I had the privilege of interviewing 3 of the Darter's crew members, the skipper, Dave McClintock, the exec, Ernie Schwab, and the TDC operator, Dennis Wilkinson. Schwab later ran aground with the Darter on Bombay Shoal, and it was at high tide, she was abandoned, they had to scuttle charges to get rid of the classified material, and I would ask him, well, what about the fact that navigators who run their ships aground don't have much future in the Navy? He said there was a provision in Navy regs that if you were in hot pursuit of the enemy, it doesn't count. You're okay. Dennis Wilkinson, one of the most interesting people I ever met. He was later the first skipper of the USS Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine, and the first skipper of the USS Long Beach. He had a wry sense of humor. He was brilliant. He could add complex numbers in his head. He showed great loyalty to his crews. On board the Darter, he tried to swim around and see what could be done, discovered not a whole lot. The time came to abandon ship, and Lieutenant Wilkinson saved the most important thing that he could from the ship. He was a brilliant poker player, and there's more to poker than cards. It's the ability to read people, and he had accumulated considerable winnings. His wife later chastised him that he saved his book of poker winnings rather than her picture.
Just a few things to add. Paul, you had mentioned the acronym TDC, Torpedo Data Computer, which I assume a number of people are going to know, but that's the device that would allow U.S. submarine crews to aim their torpedoes most effectively. Now, Darter and Commander McClintock probably didn't have to use that too thoroughly because they'd gotten within less than 1,000 yards from Kurita's flagship, Atago, and put 4 torpedoes into that ship, evidently. And then 2 more into the ship that was next to astern. Takeo, this is the one that is damaged, doesn't sink, but able to survive. And then Dace, submarine Dace, hits Maya, which is in a different column. One of the things that I think is very interesting about this interception is it speaks to some of the conditions around the broader campaign and also how the United States Navy tended to use submarines. Kurita goes through Palawan Passage in large part because he has a certain timetable to meet, and so he has to cruise at a certain speed, but he's worried about fuel consumption, particularly with his destroyers. He can't go too fast because then he'll have to stop and refuel them. So he chooses this pathway, even though the Japanese know American submarines have been prowling that area because it's the best balance of speed and also reducing the need to stop and refuel. So he's taking a calculated risk. It doesn't work out for him. That speaks to how the United States Navy is using submarines in 2 ways. One, as part of a scouting arm of the fleet. As far back as the 1920s and 1930s, the United States Navy is considering using submarines as a means for long-range scouting. This is part of where the fleet submarine idea comes from, that Darter and Dace are models of. They work out to be very effective at commerce destruction, but they're also useful for scouting ahead of the fleet. They're doing that here. But one of the reasons Kurita is worried about fuel is because of the submarine campaign that has limited Imperial Japan's ability to move fuel around. And Kurita is based where he is based in Southeast Asia in order to be close to the fuel.
Okay, so we've discussed quite a bit about the submarines. Does anyone have anything? I know Paul spoke a little bit about it. Does anyone have any further comments on the sinking of Musashi and how that may have affected everything? Apart from obviously the fact that you're down 1 Yamato. A little bit of a force change there.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. He's got a huge force crossing Sibuyan Sea, lots of targets, and there's lots of aircraft to attack those targets. By this time, the Third Fleet is immense, to put it mildly. So there's a lot of aviators out there, but they see these 2 big targets, Musashi and Yamato, biggest battleships ever built, just monsters. And so they tend to start focusing on Musashi. And that's fine, except that they could have done a lot more damage to some of these other ships. They spent, and the trouble with a battleship like that, you can't tell necessarily the damage until she starts to sink. I mean, she looks still formidable even when she's heavily damaged and so forth. So they expend too much ordnance on her, I think, is arguable. And could have done some more. So that's one aspect of it.
Well, the remarkable thing is that Yamato and Musashi, as he said, the biggest battleships in the world, bigger even than the United States intelligence imagined, really didn't take much part. They were kept behind as a fleet in being. And so Musashi essentially makes her debut, and one and done for her. So the swarming of the bees, and as Tom said, should have spread it out more, but an ignominious start and finish to a career.
That's for sure.
I think one of the crucial things here, and Alex, this may be one of the things that you're getting at, is so Vice Admiral Kurita has to abandon ship once when his cruiser is sunk, and then he has to do it again because he eventually ends up on Musashi. And so by the time the center force, rounds Samar, he has been disrupted in multiple ways, the ways that you pointed out, Tom. He's lost his original staff, configuration, charts, etc. But now he's had to abandon ship twice. How is this affecting his decision-making ability? How is the lack of all of his trained, familiarized staff members inhibiting his ability to make sense of what's happening? And what does that mean for the decisions that he makes? And because he is on the verge, I mean, we know now, retrospectively, he's fighting these task units with escort carriers in it. This is not a match for the force that he has, and yet he turns around, retires when he is on the verge of destroying more of them, and perhaps continuing to advance and disrupting plans of the United States and its allies. And so I think the fact that he has to adjust to these blows is part of his decision making.
That rather nicely leads us on to the next question, speaking of retrospectives. So obviously with a number of other battles and campaigns in the Pacific and across World War II, particularly obviously Midway and so forth, continuing scholarship has sunk some of the old sort of mainstays of these stories and replaced it with better scholarship, newer findings, so we understand more clearly what actually happened. Leyte Gulf obviously is no exception to this. So what would be some of the things that you've seen develop over the last few years or decades where new scholarship's come along and given us a new insight into what happened at any of the three engagements or as the engagement as a whole compared to, if you like, the classic story that we might find in older publications from the 50s and 60s?
Well, there's a lot of, there's so much to deal with Leyte Gulf. I mean, it's a plethora of controversy and good things and bad things and that sort of thing. One of the things I think is interesting about Leyte is that right now we're going through a presidential campaign. Don't panic, we're not going to go there. But in that campaign, Kamala Harris is talking about, she's emphasizing I'm the underdog. And there's a lot of talk about this being the underdog. And I think there's something to be said about that, because if you look at the performance of the U.S. Navy in World War II, when we were truly the underdog at the beginning, we performed pretty brilliantly. A lot of things go right. This stage, we're now not the underdog, we're the overdog, or however you term that, but we've got immense power here. And I think there becomes a certain amount of complacency. Halsey's Third Fleet staff, people are warning there's a problem, there's a possible problem, there's a problem, and they're going, yeah, okay, you know, we got this, we're, that kind of thing. So I think that is one of the things that plays into this.
I have a few examples ranging from the large to the small. Starting with the small, one of the most quoted messages of World War II was, "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." That last bit, the world wonders, was intended as padding, and there were two mistakes made. It sent Halsey into a tantrum because he thought Nimitz was needling him about where the ship should be. Rich Frank is a noted author, scholar, historian, and as a researcher, he's a human vacuum cleaner. He went to the Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, looked in the archives, found the diary or the memoir of Elmer Ettinger, who was a communications security officer on Nimitz's staff. Going through it, he found that Ettinger had criticized an ensign, and working with Chris McDougall of the museum staff, they were able to identify the culprit, whose name was Ensign John Donald Castor. He had gotten a commission because he had been on board the Northampton when she was sunk at Guadalcanal in 1942, and given a commission, but not really the experience and training. And Ettinger said in his memoir that he was the wrong person to be doing that. He was not well schooled in what constitutes the padding that should go at the beginning and the end. The first part, turkey trots to water, obviously not. But he put in the world wonders, which went back to the Crimean War and wondering about the charge of the Light Brigade. So that was the first mistake, but he put that in that could be read as part of the message. The second mistake was on board the flagship New Jersey. The radioman did not take that off, even though the letters RR there said it should be separated. Another example of new scholarship is a book called Sea of Thunder by Evan Thomas, came out in 2006. He did an amazing amount of research. He went over to Japan, interviewed a number of people. He focuses on several individuals in the book. One is Halsey, one is Admiral Ugaki, the Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet. Ernest Evans, whose heroics Tom has told about, and Kurita. Evan Thomas interviewed Kurita's daughter, said that he was a kind, gentle man. He went to sea, but he was always on the fringes of the battle. He had not really had a lot of command experience. And he was very concerned about the welfare of his men. And so that may have led into his decision to pull out rather than go on through and inflict damage on the troop transports at Leyte. He knew that it would result in the loss of life on both sides. We also can realize that he was very tired after the ordeal that these gentlemen have reported on. And then Thomas even went for the tiny details, that one of Kurita's methods of relaxing was to shoot archery on board his ship. His bow and arrows went down with the Otago. You hear about Nimitz using a pistol to calm his nerves. Evan Thomas also talked to people who were in the inside on board the New Jersey. Halsey was a sick man. Marty Irons is coming out. He'll be at the New Jersey commemoration of the battle in a couple weeks. He developed the information looking at Halsey's dental records that he had only 19 teeth. He had a bridge that didn't fit. Captain Carnes Weeks was the medical officer on Halsey's staff, and he routinely gave Halsey a shot of whiskey before bed to help him sleep. And he did so about 2000 on the night of the 24th. So when these messages came in from the scouting planes that reported that Kurita's force was again coming east, Halsey didn't find out about it till much later. It was only then that he got so upset, threw his cap on the deck. Intelligence officer was Captain Cheek, and he, like Admiral Willis Lee, had the idea that the northern force with Ozawa was a decoy, not the main force, but Halsey was so gung-ho on going to get those. And Cheek had an argument with Captain Doug Moulton, who was the air operations officer, and he was following Halsey's aggressive suggestion, go, go, go. And so he went on up and did not leave Task Force 34 to guard San Bernardino Strait, as he should have. Rear Admiral Jerry Bogan was the commander of Task Group 38.2. He sent a message to the flagship saying that he and Lee's ship should stay behind because the carrier group could provide the air cover needed for the battleships to stand up against Kurita's force coming from the west. So all these factors, I salute Thomas for just incredible research and then putting it all together in a comprehensive package.
I'd like to salute Paul because he remembers all these names. I can't remember my sister's name half the time.
Yes, Tom and I were joking before the panel that, Paul, you have an encyclopedic memory.
It's my only superpower.
We're all going to talk about Halsey. I think one of the most interesting works to come out relatively recently is Thomas Hughes' biography of him. And the way that he talks about Halsey's staff, particularly in this time, I think is really interesting and illuminating, touching on some of the things that you both talked about. He says that Halsey's staff was dominated by cliques. It wasn't very effective as a decision-making organization. It was overly centralized in Halsey's persona, as you've just made reference to, Paul. So I think that's one of the things, you know, if we're talking about sort of modern scholarship and what it has illuminated, I think that's important. I've tried to build on that with my own work most recently in the Nimitz book that was mentioned in the introductions, because I think it's crucial to understand the relationships that start to form and then are influenced by an earlier battle, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Right there, the commander of Task Force 58, it's the same commander as the Task Force 38 in Leyte Gulf. It's, you know, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, and he is sort of held back. His initiative is constrained by Admiral Spruance, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And so he develops this habit of being put in a box by the fleet commander. First Spruance, and then later Halsey expands on this and basically runs Task Force 38 himself. Mitcher is pushed to the side. Mitcher is one of these people who realizes, well, Kurita has turned around. We should probably do something about this. Should we leave the battleships here? Should we leave Bogan's task group here? And there is an anecdote. This is not tremendously new scholarship, but I find it very illuminating because Mitcher has a very talented chief of staff during this time, Commodore Arleigh Burke. Some of you are probably familiar with this gentleman. And he, you know, basically goes in and tells Mitcher, look, you know, the Japanese have turned around. We've got to do something. You've got to tell Halsey that we need to take a different action. We can't all head north. And Mitcher evidently, you know, is in his bunk at this time because it's late, and he's looking to get some sleep. He goes, does the Admiral have that information? Well, yes, sir, he does. Well, right. If he wants me to do something about it, he'll tell me. Rolls over, goes back to sleep. So how these officers interrelate, I think, is extremely important. One other thing that I want to mention is Tony Tully's book. It's probably about a decade old now, maybe a little bit longer. It's an analysis of Surigao Strait, and I learned something in there that I had not known before that I think is very interesting when we think about Surigao Strait and how it unfolds. Tully makes the point that it's likely that Vice Admiral Nishimura is on a suicide mission, deliberately, what they called in the Imperial Japanese Navy at this time a Toko mission. The battleship Yamashiro, which is one of Nishimura's ships, had been considered for a mission like this off Saipan. The Japanese were considering sending the ship to Saipan on a, much like Yamato's mission later off Okinawa, send it to the island, beach it, use its guns as artillery, use the crew as soldiers. And so the idea is already in the minds of the Japanese leadership that these old battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, are old, that they can be sacrificed. And so perhaps this is what Nishimura had in mind. And it helps explain why the two Japanese forces that enter Surigao Strait at different times are poorly coordinated. There's Nishimura's, it's first, and then there's Shima's follows second. And they don't coordinate. And Tully suggests that one of the reasons they don't coordinate makes a lot of sense if this is the case, is that Nishimura is bent on a suicide mission. Shima reports up through a different command structure, and evidently his mission was to raid and get out, and then help convoy additional ships and supplies and troops to Leyte in future days. And so they're not coordinated perhaps because they have very different objectives. And I thought that was a very illuminating idea.
Let me follow up on Burke. He sort of took tactical command temporarily and boosted the fleet speed up to 20 knots when they were going north during the night. And Halsey found out about it and held it back to 16. He didn't want to get there too early, I presume. But Burke was always the aggressive one, and too bad that he wasn't listened to when Halsey just felt so compelled to go north.
You know, Paul's comment about Admiral Kurita having to being concerned about saving lives as opposed to a sacrificial approach, and I think is valid. But the big question has always been, why did Kurita turn around? Why did he give up the advantage that he seemed to have at that point? And of course, the obvious answer is the destroyers, the escorts, are attacking in such a way that you kind of think he's wondering. He sees these ships coming at him, and it seems like they're out of their minds for even trying to do this. And he's probably thinking, what do they know that I don't? Is Halsey just over the horizon or something like that? So that's going to introduce, besides the fact that they're distracting and launching torpedoes and all that sort of stuff, it gives him pause, I think. And the other part of it is about his decision is that you got to remember that during the war, the Japanese and the Americans didn't see each other very much. The aviators saw each other. The big battles, most of them were planes attacking. They saw the ships from that angle. But surface engagements were either at night, early in Guadalcanal and that sort of thing, or they just were at a distance. So now they're up close and personal. And I'm not convinced they knew what they were seeing. There were reports that they were calling destroyers battleships and cruisers and so on. And they were these escort carriers are tiny little aircraft carriers by comparison to the fleet carriers. But they think they're looking at fleet carriers in many cases. So that's another confusion factor that I think really enters into it.
Just want to expand something on that you said, Paul, about timing. Timing is going to be very important to Halsey because the Third Fleet battle plan has survived. And Halsey's trying to get into a position, it doesn't work out, but his intent is to get into a position where as dawn erupts, he can have a battle line engagement with his battleships. He can shoot at the Japanese ships. They can be within range at the same time as attacking with the airplanes from his carriers. So it's sort of a simultaneous assault, planes and battleship guns at the same time. That's the intent. Doesn't work out, but that's one reason he would have been very concerned about speed.
Halsey was advised not to send out scout planes because they would alert Ozawa, and he sent them out anyway, and so Ozawa backed off farther. And I talked to a man named Ned Matthews, who was on Admiral Lee's staff. He had the morning watch on October 25th, and he was high in the flagship Washington, Task Force 34. And he said the battleships just fanned out. There were 6 of them in a line abreast. David McCampbell, the top fighter ace of World War II, was overhead. And at one point, he said he saw both the Japanese fleet and the American fleet heading toward each other and could not understand why Halsey turned south. Admiral Kincaid, we haven't talked much about, was Commander 7th Fleet, and divided command was certainly an issue here, that they didn't coordinate Halsey or Kincaid. He was a classmate of Vice Admiral Willis Lee at the Naval Academy in 1908. And he later wrote, "I can just imagine the frustration that my classmate Lee felt. His ships steamed 300 miles north, 300 miles south in the biggest naval battle of the war and didn't fire a shot."
So speaking of firing shots in the biggest naval battle, of course, if you add up all 3 engagements, Cape Engano, Samar, and Surigao Strait, and perhaps throw in the ships that were lost on the way at Sibuyan Sea and so forth, we're talking about a huge amount of shipping on both sides, and particularly the Japanese are throwing essentially everything in the kitchen sink in terms of their capital ships at this operation. So was this the Kantai-Kessen? Was this the decisive battle that the Japanese were looking for? Or was that the Battle of Philippine Sea sometime earlier? Or did the Japanese never get their decisive battle and just die a death of 1,000 cuts? It just happens to be this one's a bit of a bigger one than some of the others.
I would combine Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf as the biggest battle, the decisive battle, because Japan's air wing was wiped out in June, Great Marianas Turkey shoot. So this led to Ozawa not having much in the way of air power when he played his decoy card. So then the airplanes just marauded on Ozawa's meager force, sank the Suikaku, which was the last surviving ship from the Pearl Harbor raid, 3 small carriers. But the 2 combination carrier battleships, Issei and Hyuga, escaped. And we can only imagine that if Lee had been allowed to go in amongst them, they would have been gone anyway. So the air power was wiped out in June. The surface power was wiped out in October. You have the mighty Yamato, which was considered one of the joke that it was one of the most useless things ever conceived. She didn't have enough oil to operate. She went back and wound up on a suicide mission herself for the honor of Japan, supposedly. Evan Thomas makes an interesting point. He said there's imbued by the armed services during World War II that to be captured is disgraceful. You fight to the death. You never surrender. And Thomas said that was a upset, a turning around by the military, which had a lot of influence, to the old samurai corps, which did not emphasize sacrificing for the admiral, or the empire, that is. So the death of 1,000 cuts came at Okinawa with the kamikazes, people who were willing and eager in some cases to go off and die for the emperor. And they inflicted horrible damage on the fleet, U.S. fleet at Okinawa.
Paul makes a good point, but one thing I think is important, your point is well taken about Philippine Sea, and I think that is probably, the Japanese went into that, viewing that, as you say, as the ultimate Mahanian battle. But I think after that, after what happened, after they're decimated, now we're in desperation mode. And Shogo, Operation Victory, which is their response at Leyte Gulf, they know that this is sacrificial, that this is the last, all we can do. They've lost their air cover and that sort of thing. And then, of course, the Okinawa thing is another act of desperation, but it's a whole different approach. Up until then, they were eager for a fleet battle. They tried to lure us into Midway in this big fleet battle. Is the whole point of that. So on the one hand, they're trying to make this Mahanian battle, this big decisive thing. After that, I think we're looking at, desperation.
I think to answer this question, is it a decisive battle? This Kantai Kessen, we have to try to appreciate where that concept fits in the Japanese strategy, right? So it's not just a victory at sea. In some ways, it's not Mahanian in that it would secure sea control. What the Japanese are looking for is a battle that is going to convince the Allied people, particularly the citizenry of the United States, that the war is no longer worth fighting. So Pearl Harbor fits in this category, right? Pearl Harbor is supposed to be shattering blow at the war's outset, destroy the United States Navy and its fighting capability, but more importantly, convince the people of the United States that it's not worth fighting for Asia. It's not worth it. Let us have it. We'll create our greater co-prosperity sphere, and you can have the other hemisphere, and everything will be fine. It doesn't work, right? The American people are incensed. Pour into the war. Then they tried again. Midway, similar. Draw the U.S. fleet out. Destroy its fighting strength. Convince the Americans the war isn't worth fighting. And this is the theme that recurs. They tried to do it, right? Saipan, Philippine Sea. There, it's a very three-dimensional thing. We've talked a lot about the Imperial Japanese Navy, but they pack Saipan with army troops from Asia. There would have been even more defenders there if U.S. submarines hadn't sank so many of the troop ships. But as it is, there's about twice as many defenders on Saipan as Nimitz's intelligence organization estimates. And so Nimitz revises his plans for the follow-on operations, Operation Stalemate, the Palaus, seize much less territory, in order to make it easier to continue the pace of the advance, because the Japanese conceived of this idea: we'll stop them on land, we'll bring air power, we'll bring sea power together, we'll win this decisive battle again. It doesn't work at Saipan in the Philippine Sea. It does delay some things. And then I do think they tried again at Leyte. I don't think we should view Leyte through the lens of desperation, at least in so much as I think the Japanese still think a conventional approach, largely, to this kind of action could win. It still doesn't work. But they maintain this focus on how do we convince the American people, this is what they perceive to be the center of gravity, how can we undermine their morale? How can we convince them that they can't win? And I think you see the shift in two ways. We've mentioned the kamikazes already. One thing I want to say about them is it's easy to interpret that as an act of desperation, sacrifice for the emperor. However, there's logic to it. Before Leyte Gulf, Halsey takes the Third Fleet, raids the Ryukyus in Formosa. There's a 3-day air battle over Formosa. The Japanese lose a number of planes that's almost equivalent to Philippine Sea. And so this is really why they don't have planes at Leyte. They have built up some, but they're destroyed. And so what they learn is we cannot attack U.S. carrier forces using conventional means. If we send massed air groups against them, we're just going to be destroyed. The air defense mechanism is too effective. How do we combat this? Well, let's not send a massed air group. Let's send planes in smaller groups, 1 or 2 at a time, coming from multiple different directions. Let's overwhelm the air defense capabilities of these U.S. task forces. But if we do that, how do we ensure that we can inflict enough damage, because the odds of getting a hit are decreased, that the attack will be worthwhile? Well, let's turn each plane into a cruise missile so that any plane that hits produces a maximum amount of damage. And that's what they do. Yes, there's sacrifice involved with kamikaze, but there's also really cold and brutal logic. And they do the same thing on land. After Leyte, after the fighting around Saipan, they shift their tactics on land. They don't want to win the land battle anymore. They just want to kill as many opposing soldiers and Marines as possible. And they start that on Luzon. You see that at Peleliu. And of course, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which we've already talked about. They don't want to win anymore. They just want to say, okay, if you want to keep fighting us, you can. But we're going to kill as many of you as possible until we exhaust your capacity to continue this war. And I think it would be a mistake to just see that as desperation, because when you look at some of the debates over the invasion of the Japanese home islands, some of the debates over the use of the atomic bomb, this is influencing American military and political leadership.
Thank you very much. So we have enough time, I think, for our fourth backup question. So early on in the war, and you all alluded to this earlier in our discussion, earlier on in the war, US Navy encountering the Japanese Navy at night off Guadalcanal doesn't necessarily work out for the best. Conversely, Surigao Strait, US Navy and the Japanese Navy meet at night again. Really, really doesn't work out very well for the Japanese at all. So what elements of any of the three engagements at Leyte Gulf do you think epitomize the advancement of both technology and tactics, so the men and the machines, during the Pacific campaign that takes us from that point in 1942, where you get disasters like Savo Island, through to Leyte Gulf, where Southern Force gets wiped out, Northern Force gets wiped out, and Center Force gets sent running off by 2 destroyer escorts and a destroyer?
Well, an obvious answer is radar. Radar is very, very new during Guadalcanal. Some of the captains there and don't even appreciate what it can do and misuse it at best. Later on, of course, by the time we get to the later part of the war, well, radar has become very common, and so when people are used to it and they know how to use it, they develop the Combat Information Center within the ships to use that information to their advantage. So I think that's one of the obvious big changes, and I think we lead the Japanese in that too. they have a big advantage at Guadalcanal. They've developed night tactics where for some reason, they can see better than we can at night and so forth, and that plays there. But radar is going to cancel that out later on.
I have to put in a plug for Willis Lee.
Of course.
He was the winner at Guadalcanal of one of the only 2 battleship versus battleship duels of the Pacific War. He wrote in his action report that our ability to use fire control radar was the difference maker. Other than that, we were well matched. And they had 4 destroyers out in front of the column of 2 battleships. 3 of the 4 did not survive the battle. They were burning because they were the targets for the Japanese torpedoes and gunfire. South Dakota had a power failure, and she steered to starboard. Washington steered to port. The effect was that the South Dakota was silhouetted by the burning destroyers and became the target. Her superstructure was riddled. I talked to one of the men who had served in the South Dakota, and he talked about the task of going up into that superstructure with no light and trying to find bodies and parts of bodies of shipmates. You can imagine what a terrible emotional toll that was. Some years later, this man, Paul Backus, was shipmates with a man who'd been on that venturesome party, and he said he was having terrible flashbacks to that night. And sometimes he'd be grabbing his wife by the throat. And he wound up going to the Philadelphia Naval Hospital for treatment. And the answer was hypnotism that brought out that deep underlying, what we call PTSD. And that solved it. It liberated him from that terrible night. Lee had been a strong opponent, a proponent of fire control radar and lots of anti-aircraft guns. And the irony was that the radar control gun, anti-aircraft guns were so capable that Lee was rendered a passenger in his flagship because the battleships were mixed in with the carrier task groups providing the AA, and seldom had the chance to fire the big guns except in shore bombardment. And the one opportunity, the thing that Lee had been looking for his whole war, was the chance to shoot against the enemy ships, and he was deprived of that opportunity. I talked to his flag lieutenant, a man named Gil Ertzen, and Lee has been criticized for not being more aggressive going after the Japanese in the Marianas because his ships had not had a chance to train together. Well, now they had at Leyte and didn't have the opportunity. But Lee pointed out to him the big difference in the situations. In Marianas, the Japanese were sailing away. They did not constitute a threat. At Leyte, they were very much a threat. His ships could have crossed the T as they popped out of Surigao Strait, and he never got the opportunity.
The old U.S. battleships do have the opportunity at Surigao, and one of the things that I think is fascinating when you look at that battle is it is a remarkable integration of pre-war concepts of how the U.S. Navy wanted to fight and wartime capability that Tom was alluding to. Yes, there's radar, but we have to understand radar has gotten more sophisticated in the 2 years between Guadalcanal and Leyte Gulf. Some of the older battleships still have the same kind of radars that were being used for fire control at Guadalcanal, the kind that Lee used. But some of the other ships have a more advanced set, a Mark 8 as opposed to a Mark 3. It's a much higher resolution radar. It can be used for fire control in its entirety. Using a Mark 8, you could correct for range and bearing. You've got a very sophisticated spotting scope that allowed you to look at the target in the center of your screen, and shell splashes landing around it. So you could correct both for range and bearing. With a Mark III, you can only correct for range. You have to have visual bearings on the target, otherwise you can't shoot very accurately. That's one of the reasons South Dakota didn't shoot as accurately as Washington. She tried to use her Mark III for both. But what happens is not only accurate battleship gunfire, but a very old technique is employed at Surigao. In the Atlantic Fleet Torpedo Flotilla, before the United States enters World War I, they developed this technique. They call it the night search and attack. Destroyers have to go out, find an enemy formation, and then attack it with torpedoes, ideally without being seen, or at least launching torpedoes before they're seen. And at Surigao, you have Captain Jesse Coward. He is a veteran of the fighting off Guadalcanal. He has been in night battles before. He is not part of Vice Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's task group. But his destroyers are patrolling nearby, and he volunteers. Basically says, hey, Oldendorf, I got an idea. I'm going to go down the strait. I'm going to take my destroyers. We're going to split up. We're going to go down both sides of the straits. I'll launch some torpedoes, and I'll get out. And he conducts, effectively, a night search and attack. Now, he doesn't have to search much because of radars and because of the confined waters of the strait. But Coward's ships mount an extremely impressive torpedo attack. They sink one of the Japanese battleships, Fuso, and then they sink 3 of the 4 destroyers, or at least disable 3 of the 4 destroyers that are leading the Japanese column. So in essence, the Japanese formation loses about half of its strength because of this initial attack. They withdraw. And then Oldendorf's battle begins to take place. It unfolds. The other destroyers from the other flanks and in the center also make their attacks. And as they're finishing those, the ones on the flank, the cruisers open fire. They're at either end of Oldendorf's line. And then the battleships open fire. And this is another idea that the U.S. Navy had practiced for years. The idea that, at least in a daylight engagement, we will combine all the factors of strength that we have. We'll conduct torpedo attacks in concert with battleship gunfire. At Surigao, they're able to do it at night because of the improvement in technology, but also because of the improvement in tactics and doctrine. Oldendorf's ships hadn't had the same opportunities as Lee's. They were mostly confined to bombardment. The majority of their shells are well suited for that, not armor piercing that are suited for anti-ship work. But he turns to the correct page in a new Navy manual, Pac 10, that was issued in June 1943, picks out the right kind of formation for his group and says, look, we're going to use this battle plan right here in the book. Here's the code number for it. Everybody know, boom, this is what we're going to do. And it works. It all integrates together. And so the Japanese, Nishimura's force is overwhelmed. Not only is it outnumbered, but in terms of tactics and doctrine, it doesn't have an answer. The Japanese have no equivalent to the Combat Information Center. The radar isn't as good. In effect, they're fighting blind, whereas the U.S. forces are fighting in the equivalent of daylight.
I want to give a plug to a study that Trent's dad, Dr. Thomas Hone, is working on. It's about the reconstruction of ships that were damaged at Pearl Harbor. And one of the effects was they got modern fire control in most of the ships, and that enabled them. The Pennsylvania did not, and she played virtually no part in the battle.
All right. Thank you very much to our panelists. That concludes the bit where we talk to each other and you kind of all watch from out there. So we're actually within 30 seconds of our time, so we're doing really well there. Now, this is, of course, the part where you get to pose questions to us. We do have a few questions that have come in from the viewership out there on the great internet. So, yeah, what we'll do, if we'll ping back and forth, one person from here, one person from online, and so forth until we run out of time. And in the interest of time, if we maybe just have one answer per question, and we can sort of cycle around. So, who wants to start off in the live audience?
While he's approaching the mic, I'd like to make a quick comment. We're doing an awful lot of inside baseball talk here. And so many in the audience probably know exactly what we're talking about, but some of you may not. And please don't hesitate to bring us to, ask them, what did you mean by such and such? I mean, we make references and assume you all know what we're talking about. So I would encourage you to take advantage of that.
Admiral, my question is for Trent Hone, and that relates to the strategic picture. If you could elaborate a bit about that. We haven't heard about MacArthur. I don't think he's been mentioned once. Being a former Army guy, I wanted to get a plug in for him. But, there was a major disagreement between Nimitz and MacArthur and others on both sides with regard to, is there even a need for a Philippine invasion? Or would the Central Pacific Drive be enough to beat the Japanese? Of course, it gets into the political side. But it also alludes to what was mentioned earlier, the divided command. If you could go in, Kincaid, of course, commander of the 7th Fleet, reported to MacArthur. The others reported to Halsey and Nimitz. If you could talk a little bit about the strategic picture of this whole thing.
Yeah, thank you very much. MacArthur is extremely important because this, at Leyte, is where the two offensives, the one led by MacArthur from the Southwest Pacific area and the one led by Admiral Nimitz across the Central Pacific, come together. And Nimitz is very deft, I think, at how he creates the opportunity for this assault on Leyte much earlier than anticipated. It's triggered by a raid that Halsey takes with the 3rd Fleet into the Philippines, covering Operation Stalemate, the assaults in the Palaus. Halsey reports that the Japanese seem very weak and there's an opportunity to accelerate the advance. Nimitz agrees, let's bypass intermediate objectives, let's move to Leyte. MacArthur agrees through his chief of staff. He personally is at sea observing radio silence at the time, but it works out. One of the things that I think is crucial, Ed, you had mentioned, there's some question, is an assault on the Philippines necessary? The Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I think both MacArthur and Nimitz had agreed there needs to be a base in the sort of Southeast Asian littoral that is going to support an intensified bombardment and blockade of Japan. And the question is that going to be Luzon or is that going to be Formosa? And ultimately, Luzon is decided upon with the idea that you could make an earlier assault in the Philippines somewhere, either Mindanao and then Leyte, or Leyte directly and then advance to Luzon. The alternative of Formosa is dismissed in large part because eventually the various staffs, both in Washington and in Nimitz's headquarters in Hawaii, realize that they don't have the assault shipping capacity to make that work, particularly as the fighting in Europe expands and is to some degree slower than anticipated. So some of the earlier plans that would have supported an invasion of Formosa relied on Army divisions that aren't available in the Pacific because they have to go to Europe.
Okay, from online, someone has asked, was there an air commander on scene, this would be at Sipiyan Sea, who could have directed the carrier air attacks on Kurita's forces more effectively, presumably, than just all ganging up on poor old Musashi?
There was not, and Bogan had volunteered to do that and stick with Lee's Task Force 34. Halsey was so single-mindedly obsessive with those Awas force that he didn't do it.
Fair enough. Gentleman over here on the right.
Bob Bungie. I guess my questions may be more in the weeds. I mean, given even at Samar, given even the rain and the smoke and other things happening, how would you grade the Japanese fire control? Seems like they fired a lot of shells, and yeah, they did damage, of course, but.
I think we can criticize the ability they're shooting off Samar. I think in general Japanese fire control was quite good. We can see evidence of that off Guadalcanal, certainly. One of the criticisms that U.S. Navy observers offered after the fighting at Samar was that sometimes Japanese spreads, right? Because not all, you'd like all the shells to sort of hit in a narrow spot, but some of these Japanese spreads were so tight that at long range, it made it even more difficult to hit. If you have a little bit of a dispersion, there's sort of a sweet spot. What is the best amount of dispersion? What is sort of your error in your fire control setup? there's a sweet spot in terms of that amount of dispersion. To some degree, at least the U.S. Navy observers felt that the Japanese spreads were often too tight, so it didn't account for some of the errors in their fire control. I wonder also how some of those errors might be attributable to the fact that they were mistaking ship types, right? Treating destroyers as cruisers potentially, or treating the escort carriers as fleet carriers, and so perhaps incorrectly estimating some things. But I think, when the Japanese were on their game, they were very good.
I'll just add quickly to that the fact that when you're looking at primarily optically based fire control for the Japanese, they do have some radar, but it's not accurate to the way the US radar is. It means that if you've got a ship like Johnston dancing in and out of the rain squalls, for Johnston, as long as her radar's operational, she can maintain her range and bearing calculations and keep her fire control lock on the Japanese. Every time one of the US ships disappears behind smoke or a rain squall or whatever, completely resets the board. So Japanese optical fire control, once they're ranged in, is really good, but every time a US ship pops up, they have to redo those calculations, send off some testing salvos, make the corrections, and then they're back on target. And by that time, someone's ducked in away again. They're all back to square one. So from online, we've got a question that says, was the Japanese bomber that landed the fatal hit on the USS Princeton flying out of Luzon, or was it flying from one of Admiral Ozawa's carriers? Presumably it's
I'm pretty sure that was a land-based plane.
Yeah.
I don't recall there being any belief that, well, Halsey thought it was from Ozawa's carriers, but it wasn't.
Yeah, I was just thinking, where Princeton was hit, that would be a very lost aircraft. Gentleman there?
Thank you. I have a slight hypothetical. You've already mentioned how in Subian Sea that there was a real overdog, I think it was called, and yet we only managed to sink one of the 5 battleships there. Could it be that our carriers were a little gassed, and we already had 2 of the task groups going to Leyte, so they were only hit with 2 task groups, and that was because of what was mentioned earlier, the raid on Taiwan and the Ryukyus. If Halsey hadn't done that and just prepared for the battle, do you think the results at Subian Sea would have been better?
There's a crucial factor here, which is that after the air battle's over Formosa, Halsey thinks that the Japanese fleet is going to come out and fight. They don't. And so he begins to turn his attention. He knows he has to cover Leyte, but he begins to turn his attention in terms of his planning to Operation Hotfoot, which is an anticipated carrier raid on Japan that he thinks is going to be the next opportunity for a large, decisive battle with the Japanese fleet. So he's starting to plan for that. It's supposed to come in December, if I remember right. And you're correct, he sent 2 carrier groups back to Leyte. Now, by the time the Subian Sea battle happens, there are 3 covering the Philippines and the assault on Leyte. But he's still missing his 4th. But yes, those carrier air groups are tired. They've been worked very hard in the preceding weeks. And so I think some of the limitations in their accuracy or capability are starting to show by the time of that air battle.
That's a very good point. We've mentioned Task Force 38 and Task Force 58. This was where Spruance and Halsey take turns. One's back in the backwaters. They're planning the next operation while the other one's in command of this group, and then they swap. Well, this works brilliantly for the staffs. It maximizes their effect. But there's still, I think somebody made the point, is like having a stagecoach and changing the drivers, but not the horses, And I think that's what we're looking at. These guys are out there fighting. Okay, today I'm Task Force 38, tomorrow I'm but I'm still flying airplanes and I'm getting tired. So I think there is a fatigue factor there, and that's why the performance both at Sibuyan Sea and up at Cape Engano, I think in both cases, it's you could say, well, he should have done better maybe, but easy for us to say.
Related to that, I'll take part of one of the online questions, I think, just in the interest of time. If Spruance was in command, would he have been more likely to try and draw Ozawa south and cover the San Bernardino Strait compared to Halsey charging north in an effort to kill everything in sight?
Very definitely. Well, Halsey afterwards said if their roles had been reversed, if he had been at the Marianas, he would have wiped them out then, who knows. But Halsey was very tired. We talked about the aviators being tired. Halsey was tired. He was sick. Not to dump on him, but I am. Marty Irons says that not only was his judgment flawed by his condition, his health condition at Leyte Gulf, but subsequently losing 3 ships in a typhoon in December and still more typhoon damage in June. He was a tired man and not up to the task at that point.
Gentleman here on the right.
Hi, I'm Bill Snyder. My dad was Lieutenant Snyder on the Johnston. Once Evans was down to 1 screw and had his torpedoes gone, to continue to engage with 5-inch guns, do you guys think that was a good decision, or should he have withdrawn?
Well, what would he have gained by withdrawing is one thing. I mean, he's clearly been reduced in capacity, but at the same time, these 5-inch guns are still working. And whether they're causing damage or just distracting the enemy or whatever, to be fired upon, you can't ignore it. And I think that Johnson made the right, Evans made the right decision by continuing, even though he had expended all of his torpedoes at that point.
You can compare Evans' compulsion to keep fighting with Halsey's to keep going north.
Yeah.
I think I would also probably comment that, you know, at the end of the day, a captain has an obligation to preserve his men as much as he can, but he also has a greater obligation of his duty to the Navy, to the fleet, and to the objective. And I mean, Johnston and the destroyer escorts going in, they had committed themselves very heavily, pretty much terminally. And the reason they were doing that was not for personal glory, obviously. They were trying to preserve the escort carriers. And I think Evans probably knew full well, you know, consider how many hundreds of men are on each of those escort carriers. If Yamato lands a single decent salvo on one of them, that's a lot of dead sailors. So given the speed differential, even Yamato, which is the slowest of the capital ships present in the Japanese force, can still easily run down an escort carrier given time to work up to speed. Every minute that Johnston can buy is another minute that gives those escort carriers time to get further away, which is another minute which it goes towards the survival of the men on those carriers. And it's not just the one, obviously there's multiple carriers. So I think, yes, in terms of, if you look at it from a narrow focus of could he have preserved perhaps more men on Johnston by withdrawing at that point, maybe. The Japanese might still continue to shoot at him, and on 1 screw he wasn't getting away from them. But by standing and continuing to fire with his guns, he was ensuring that, you know, that devastating salvo of half a dozen 18.1-inch shells didn't atomize one of the escort carriers. So at the end of the day, although he was sacrificing some lives, he was saving far more.
Yeah. Thank you.
Gentleman here on the left.
Oh, my name is Brian Moran, and my dad, John William Moran, he was a warrant officer. He was part of a Navy aviation support unit called Acorn 45. Now, Dad didn't talk, I mean, he let stuff slip out after Mom died. And when we got some of his service record afterwards, that's when we found out he was part of Taffy 3. Now, I've done some reading on what happened at Samar, and I even looked at the after action report that's been posted online, and they never talk about what the support groups did. And I was wondering if anyone would have an idea like what Acorn 45 did, or those support units, because honestly, I don't know if they were a Tacloban, or if Tacloban was operational, or if they were on board one of the escort carriers. And Dad, somebody said, here you go, you know, go do it, because I think he was a radio operator. Thank you.
Mic down.
Well, just speaking generically, the Acorns are the sort of pre-packaged base concept for air support. And so at this time, there would have been that kind of thing in the Marianas. in other parts across the Pacific, and that becomes essentially like a depot, a staging area for aircraft as well as an airbase to keep the flow of planes, because the fast carriers need a flow of aircraft to keep operating. There are going to be casualties, not just from Japanese action, but also from just planes that wear out, and you had to bring in new ones. And the Acorns were a vital part of that flow of aircraft and material.
Right, so we've hit our 15-minute time limit for questions. Can we keep going? Yeah, okay, apparently we can. So, gentleman here on the right.
Hi, my name is David Chang. Is there any evidence in the scholarship that the advances in U.S.-based fighter direction, did they leverage that in that component, particularly TAFIs 1 and 2, or is it more of a case of get aloft, whatever you have, fly to the AO and hit the nearest Japanese warship? Thank you.
Well, my answer to that would be, I mean, this is a very desperate situation. A lot of the aerial direction capabilities would occur with interception of incoming Japanese strikes. So these are Japanese ships. It's a little bit different. And my recollection of how the TAFIs were operating at this point were largely in a desperation mode. Get planes up as fast as you can. Maybe they're armed effectively. Maybe they're not. And if they're not, drop what kind of ordnance you have on these ships and come back and try for it again, or strafe until you run out of bullets.
Yeah, bearing in mind the TAFIs were set up initially for ground support, and you see that as the battle goes on. Initially they're showing up with fragmentation bombs, which are not really good anti-shipping weapons, but that's what they have, that's what you send out. And then as the day goes on and the planes are coming back, maybe we should put a torpedo on here.
Yes, after 80 years with all the changes in technology and the geopolitical changes in the world, what lessons should the modern U.S. Navy be actively taking and considering from Leyte, given that it was 80 years ago, and some could say it's kind of like, it's super dramatic and interesting, but it's in the rearview mirror in a lot of ways like Jutland was. And so I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on that. Thank you.
The most obvious thing lesson to take away from that is never have a divided command like we had there. we had two complete fleets operating in the same vicinity and had no common commander, no real means to communicate with each other other than to listen in on each other's traffic and that sort of thing. To get a common commander from those two fleets, you have to go to Washington, D.C. in order to get that. And that's not a good way to run a railroad or a fleet. So I think that's the number one lesson I think we come away with that is be very careful about coordination. And especially today, we've got so many assets that, compared to what we had back then. You have submarines and aircraft and drones and all sorts of things coming along. And you got to make sure that these things are coordinated in some way so that they don't wind up making assumptions like were made at Leyte Gulf or conflicting with each other.
I would add two other things, two very human things. One, like we've talked about already, Halsey's staff. Human decision making is extremely important. You have to find mechanisms, particularly if you're a more senior commander, to draw on all the information available so that you can make the most effective decision. Halsey didn't do that. The other thing is, I think Leyte is a valuable lesson on both sides of how do you relate to the enemy. You have to fight them. It's not just the material fight. You have to anticipate how they're going to try to win and look for ways to mitigate that. To some degree, the Japanese did that better. They read Halsey like a book. They draw him north. On the U.S. side, there is, I think, a less or an inadequate understanding of what the Japanese are going to try to do and how they're going to try to do it.
Courage and professional competence are useful in any time period.
Amen.
Hi, John Barry. I had the privilege of doing an independent study on Leyte Gulf during my senior year at the Air Force Academy as an astronautical engineering major. And my uncle, John Rawls, was present on Tacloban as the adjutant for the 49th Fighter Group. They did not take part in this action because the air component had not deployed forward yet. I have two questions. One, no one has touched about the role of PT boats in Surigao Strait and their effectiveness or lack thereof. And two, and this plays into what we do today, was Halsey's choice of flagship an influence on his reluctance to leave the battleships?
Well, the PT boats, they were down at the south end of Surigao Strait, placed there as almost like pickets, waiting for, we knew the Japanese were coming, and so they were down there to give early warning and also to use their torpedoes, if possible, to attack the enemy. They did very well at the early warning, not so well with the torpedoes. There were no successful hits and so forth. But they did provide a service in that regard, and so the units further up north had good early warning that they were coming. So
Your second observation is very perceptive. Halsey was in a battleship. He wanted to be with the carriers to go see the denouement, and therefore he was reluctant to leave them behind.
yeah, it's probably true.
Yeah, yeah, and contrast that with Spruance, right? He chooses a cruiser in Annapolis. That's his flagship. So he's not wedded to a battleship or a particular place in the battle. Halsey is, very much so.
And had he been on a carrier, too, he would have had the direct exposure to the air wings. So, thank you.
David Miller, I'm doing research on some of the allied subjects. The first of the carriers that Halsey had to give up, the first three carriers, there was actually a more complicated story. Now, this comes off some microfilm rolls at Newport, and I can't give you an exact site. They had suffered very high casualties flying level missions over Manila Bay at 12,000 feet, and they weren't allowed to change. So the casualties among the pilots had gone up, and there was essentially a revolt on the Bonhomme Richard. The pilots were asking to be taken off flight status. The captain was saying no, and the flight surgeons sided with the pilots. And at that point, he was forced to send the first three carriers, which were 90 days overdue for a replacement air group. And that's the reason for the first three carriers. I can't speak to the second three.
Okay. Is there,
Thank you very much.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tim Karstrom. My dad was a flight deck officer in the White Plains, middle of a Task Force 3, and eventually he was a graduate of the War College. And he told me about 50 years ago that we crossed the T for the last time, I guess he was saying, in the action off Samar. Is that still considered to be true? He passed away in 1986, but he was active, very active in the Naval Reserve right through.
I think he's probably thinking of Surigao Strait, because Surigao Strait is very much that. I mean, it's an obvious T. The Japanese are approaching north, and the Oldendorf's force is steaming back and forth at the top of the strait. So it's almost an ideal setup. As far as that being the last time, I can't draw another time.
I don't know
that
of any
occurs more recently.
examples.
Yeah. There was almost a crossing the T in the Falklands War, when the hilariously poorly named Captain Coward was assigned the job of what happens if Belgrano comes at the task force, and his solution was, I'll take 6 destroyers and charge Belgrano headlong with his 4.5-inch guns, which would have been entertaining. But of course that never happened, so he didn't get an opportunity to cross the T, although that was his plan. So yeah, I think Surigao Strait remains the last time anyone crossed the T of a gun line. And I think by the appearance of our host, I think we're done.
Yeah, I think we are done. But I do want to thank this esteemed panel for a great job, fantastic job. I want to thank everyone who came to this event. There's several hundred that are beaming in on YouTube. So again, I just want to thank you, whether you're here in person or beaming in I appreciate it. It makes me proud to be part of this organization when I see an event like this. And judging by the number of questions, and there are several more in the online version here that we were unable to get to, but just judging by the number and the quality of the questions that were asked, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give this one a 12. So thank you all for contributing, and thanks for this panel. And as a small token of our appreciation to our panelists, you're going to get a Naval Institute Press book entitled Nimitz's Newsman, Waldo Drake, and the Navy's Censored War in the Pacific by Hamilton Bean. So thank you for your participation. Appreciate it. And now we're signing out in the lobby, correct? All right, thank you again, everyone.